Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about regular verbs in the past tense. These regular verbs in the past tense have an ending of ed. For example, want becomes wanted. Verbs are not the only ones that like to use ed for their endings. Adjectives also thought that they'd follow after their fellow man, the verb, and choose an ed to follow their endings too. For example, relax becomes relaxed. Now, you may ask yourself, isn't that just another verb with an ed ending? Well, that's a good question. Relax is a verb, but when you add an ed to the ending, it becomes an adjective. Apparently, this verb wanted to be more like an adjective this time. As well as regular verbs and adjectives, some past participles also use an ed ending. They are the perfect tense forms of a verb in passive voice. For example, we have finish, which becomes finished. Now that we've explained which ones use an ed ending, let's get into the details of the sounds we get from an ed ending. So, this can become a problem for non-native speakers because it can be pronounced in 3 different ways. First, we have id becoming id, we have t, and we have d. So we get id, t, and d. Now, before we learn the different ways to pronounce ed, we must first know what voiced and voiceless consonants are. We'll start out with voiced. A voiced consonant, or sound, means that it uses the vocal cords to produce a vibration or humming sound in the throat. Put your finger on your throat and then pronounce the letter L. You will notice a slight vibration in your throat and neck. That is because it's voiced. Let's try that again. L. Now that you can feel that your vocal cords are vibrating, you know that that is a voiced consonant. The next sound we have is a voiceless sound. So therefore, it's not a sound. Is when there is no vibration in your throat and the sound comes from your mouth. Pronounce the letter P. You will notice how it comes from your mouth. The P sound doesn't come from your throat. Now you can try this with the other letters and you'll feel the difference between a voiced and a voiceless consonant. Now we know the difference between voiced and voiceless sounds. We can look at the following rules for the correct pronunciation of ed. Our first one is going to be id. If the last letter of the word is spelled with a d or a t, the ed is pronounced as a separate syllable with an id sound. For example, we have want. It becomes wanted. We have need, which becomes needed. There are some examples of how we get to our id. So every regular verb that ends in a t or a d will have an id sound if it is in the past tense. Moving on, we have the t sound. If the last consonant of the word is voiceless, then the ed is pronounced as a t. Be careful not to create an extra syllable or id sound. Our examples here are talk, which becomes talked. As you can tell, the 2 consonants are right next to each other. For some, this can be difficult getting the 2 harsh consonant sounds enunciated. We also have an example of kiss, which becomes kissed, which becomes a little bit easier with our S and our T. The S isn't as harsh as a K. The next example we have is help, which becomes helped. Notice that none of these had an id. So again, our examples are talked, kissed, and helped. Now let's move on to our last sound, which is the D. Now these are used for voiced consonants when the ed is pronounced like a D. Our examples are play, which becomes played. Our next example is close, which becomes closed. We don't want to get closed, we want closed. Notice how the S turned into a Z or Z sound when you say closed. Our next example is live, which becomes lived. Now that we've finished all of the different sounds that the ED can have, thankfully only 3, I will go into the details of our voiced and voiceless consonants. The first one being voiceless, our T sound. Our first consonant is P. Our example is helped. Next is K. Our example is looked. Our next word is F. Our example is sniffed. The next one is GH. Our example is laughed. Our next word is SH, and our example is washed. Our next word is CH, and our example is watched. Our next letter is double S or SS. Our example is kissed. Our next letter is C, and our example is danced. And our final consonant is X, and our example is fixed. That is the list for our voiceless consonants. Moving on to our voiced consonants, these sounds being a D. Our first letter is L, and our example is called. The next letter is in, and our example is cleaned. And the next letter is R, our example being offered. The next letter is G, our example being damaged. Our next letter is V, and its example is loved. Our next letter is S, and our example is used. Our next letter is Z, or Z, and our example is amazed. Our next letter is B, and our example being rubbed. And our final letter being M, and its example is claimed. Now that we've been through both lists, I hope that this helps you in understanding ED endings and the rules that go along with it. Thank you for joining me today, and join me next time.